Inside America's most secure prison, inmates aren't just locked away, they're starved of dignity. From Nutraloaf punishment meals to cold bread and cereal rations, life inside solitary isn't just isolation, it's slow starvation. This is the forgotten hunger. Before we begin, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because what you're about to hear comes straight from court records, inmate testimonies, and government reports they never wanted the public to see. At ADX Florence, known as the Alcatraz of the Rockies, mealtime doesn't resemble what most Americans would call food. Behind steel doors, inmates in solitary confinement receive sack meals, small paper bags with dry cereal, a slice of processed cheese, and a piece of plain bread. No hot food. No variety. No comfort. Former inmate Jack Powers, who spent over a decade inside ADX, described the experience as eating just enough to stay alive, not enough to feel human. He told Amnesty International that during disciplinary lockdowns, even these minimal meals were halved. Bread became stale, cheese turned hard and sour. Sometimes guards replaced it with what prisoners called the loaf. The Nutraloaf, a mixture of beans, vegetables, flour, and oil baked into a dense brick, is technically designed to meet nutritional minimums. But its real purpose, inmates and human rights lawyers say, is punishment. Cold, tasteless, and dry, the loaf often caused nausea or vomiting. Former staffers admitted under oath that it was used to control behavior, a silent message, complain and we'll make eating unbearable. At Tamms Correctional Center in Illinois, now shuttered after public outcry, this same loaf was served 3 times a day during disciplinary periods. Reports from the Illinois Department of Corrections described it as nutritionally adequate, but inmate accounts painted a different picture. Men losing weight rapidly, their skin graying, their teeth decaying. Human Rights Watch called it a form of degradation masked as discipline. And in ADX, it wasn't just about punishment, it was about control. Every bite, every crumb was a reminder, you have no say not even in your own hunger. As one inmate wrote in a smuggled letter, I stopped being hungry after a while. I stopped feeling like I was alive at all. For decades, the United States prison system has insisted that the Nutraloaf, sometimes called disciplinary loaf, is not punishment. Officials claim it's a behavior management tool, served only to inmates who throw food, flood their cells, or refuse to comply. But dig into court filings and testimonies and another story emerges, one that reeks not just of stale bread and pureed vegetables, but of systemic abuse hidden behind nutritional labels. The recipe itself sounds clinical, almost absurdly so. Carrots, spinach, beans, oil, flour, and powdered milk, blended into a dough and baked until it forms a hard, flavorless brick. Sometimes prison staff added applesauce or raisins. Other times they didn't bother. Served without seasoning, sauce, or even a utensil, the loaf came on a tray cold, and was often the only meal an inmate received for days or weeks. Inmates in ADX Florence and Tamms Correctional Center both reported similar routines. Breakfast loaf, lunch loaf, dinner loaf. Each identical, each tasteless, each a reminder that punishment and isolation didn't end with the cell door, it continued on the plate. In 2008, the Vermont Supreme Court described the Nutraloaf as a punitive meal that serves no legitimate penological purpose. Across the country, civil rights attorneys began filing lawsuits, arguing that such food violated the Eighth Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishment. One such case, Prude v. Clark, 2012, came out of Wisconsin. Inmate Norman Prude was fed Nutraloaf for 7 days straight. By the 4th day he vomited uncontrollably. By the 7th he couldn't keep water down. The court ruled that forcing prisoners to eat something that caused gastrointestinal distress and weight loss could indeed be unconstitutional. In another instance at Tamms, an inmate named Anthony Gay, who spent more than a decade in solitary confinement, wrote letters to his attorney describing the loaf as a way to make you lose your mind faster. When asked by human rights investigators how it felt, Gay replied, "It's not food. It's a message, you are nothing." Even correctional staff have admitted discomfort with the practice. A former guard at ADX Florence, speaking anonymously to the Marshall Project, said, "We all knew what the loaf was for. It wasn't about health or safety. It was about power, showing them who was in charge." By the mid-2010s, the controversy had spread nationwide. New York, California, and Illinois began phasing out the Nutraloaf after public pressure. The American Correctional Association, once a staunch defender of such disciplinary tools, quietly revised its nutritional standards to exclude punitive food. Yet the practice never fully disappeared. Even after Tamms was shut down in 2013 for inhumane conditions, Advocates say similar meals persist under new names: restricted diet, special management meal, or food control protocol. The Amnesty International 2014 report on U.S. supermax prisons labeled the diet as a form of psychological degradation. The report quoted multiple ADX inmates who said their punishment diets were directly tied to mental health deterioration, paranoia, hopelessness, and self-harm. When food becomes a weapon, it ceases to be nourishment. In solitary confinement, every deprivation, from light to human touch to flavor, is part of the design. The hunger isn't only for calories. It's for control, compassion, and identity, all of which the system systematically strips away. As one federal inmate wrote in a letter smuggled out of Florence, "You can survive weeks without taste, but you start dying inside the first day you realize no one cares what you eat." Deep in the Colorado desert, surrounded by razor wire and mountains, ADX Florence stands like a concrete monument to control. Inmates call it the tomb of the living. Inside its isolation units, time collapses, sound disappears, and hunger becomes more than just a sensation. It becomes a language of suffering. Each cell is a 7 by 12-foot box, built almost entirely from poured concrete. Meals arrive through a narrow metal slot, 3 times a day, precisely timed, with no human interaction beyond the gloved hand of a correctional officer. For most inmates in solitary confinement, this is the only physical contact they'll have for years. The menu is designed for function, not comfort. Breakfast might be dry cereal with powdered milk. Lunch, a cold sandwich with a slice of bologna. Dinner, a scoop of beans or rice sealed in plastic. Former inmates say the food is sometimes spoiled, undercooked, or deliberately cold, served with no utensils, no seasoning, and no explanation. "They want you to feel it," said Jack Powers, who spent over a decade in the Special Housing Unit, SHU, at ADX. "Not just the hunger, the humiliation that comes with it." Medical reports from within ADX confirm that prolonged isolation affects metabolism. The Federal Bureau of Prisons, BOP, itself has documented that inmates in extended solitary confinement experience weight loss, digestive issues, and nutrient deficiencies. According to one internal memo obtained by the Marshall Project, inmates in disciplinary segregation often consume fewer calories than standard population prisoners, not by accident, but as part of a caloric adjustment for compliance. Dr. Terry Kupers, a psychiatrist who has studied supermax conditions for decades, describes hunger in solitary as a psychological echo chamber. Inmates begin to obsess over meals. The arrival of food trays becomes the only break in monotony. Some eat slowly, savoring every crumb just to make time move. Others stash bread under mattresses, rationing bites like prisoners of war. "When you're locked away for years," Kupers said, "your relationship to food becomes distorted. You start dreaming about flavor. Even the smell of bread becomes an event. For some, hunger becomes rebellion." Letters smuggled from ADX reveal multiple hunger strikes, often launched in protest of isolation conditions or punishment diets. Inmates refused meals for days, demanding fair treatment or medical care. One report from 2013 noted that an inmate went without food for 22 days after being denied commissary privileges. "They said I was doing it for attention," he wrote. "But I was doing it because it was the only thing I could still control." The psychological toll of starvation in solitary isn't just about emptiness, it's about invisibility. With no one to see them, no one to care, prisoners say they begin to fade both physically and mentally. Psychologists describe it as erasure by deprivation. Every missed meal, every flavorless loaf, every cold tray becomes part of the slow erosion of the self. One former ADX inmate described the moment he realized he was breaking. "I started to count the calories in my dreams. I'd wake up and taste metal in my mouth, like hunger had become part of me." In Tamms Correctional Center, before its closure, similar testimonies surfaced. Inmates were reportedly so starved for texture and flavor that they would mix toothpaste with water and drink it, describing the mint as something to feel. Guards often joked about feeding the ghosts. This cruel irony, that a country with one of the most advanced prison systems on earth could allow slow starvation, remains one of America's most quietly kept secrets. While politicians debate reform and bureaucrats redefine humane treatment, the men inside ADX and similar facilities continue to eat meals designed not to nourish, but to remind them of their place, forgotten, unseen, and silent. Because at ADX Florence, hunger isn't just physical. It's policy. It's the sound of power echoing through an empty stomach. In the world beyond prison walls, hunger is a temporary discomfort. Inside ADX Florence or the long-closed Tamms Correctional Center, hunger is policy, a slow, deliberate erosion of the human will. But the system didn't count on one thing: the voices that refused to stay quiet. Every now and then a letter slipped past the censors. A torn scrap of paper hidden inside legal mail. A message smuggled through the walls, written in tiny print and folded into soap bars, Bible pages, or envelopes marked attorney-client privilege. One of the earliest letters to spark public outrage came from Jack Powers, the same inmate who spent years in the ADX control unit. In his 2007 testimony before a federal court, he described meals that were deliberately designed to degrade. He recalled being fed Nutraloaf, 4 weeks at a time, watching his weight drop as his mental health collapsed. They called it food, Powers wrote, but it was punishment served cold. Powers wasn't alone. Thomas Silverstein, one of ADX's most infamous inmates, who spent over 35 years in solitary confinement, also documented his experience in handwritten notes released after his death. "They fed us like animals," he wrote. "Sometimes the bread had mold. Sometimes the milk was sour. You learn not to complain, because complaining only gets you less." At Tamms, inmate Reginald Brown wrote to the U.S. District Court of Illinois that during one lockdown, the restricted diet lasted 21 consecutive days. He said the loaf made him physically sick and guards mocked him when he vomited. His letter concluded with words that would later be quoted in legislative hearings. "I am starving but not for food. I'm starving for someone to remember I exist." The ACLU's National Prison Project began collecting such testimonies in the early 2010s. Over 200 letters described food as both sustenance and suffering. Many inmates reported losing 20 to 40 pounds in just months. Others said they'd rather skip meals than endure the humiliation of the loaf. In 2012, a class-action lawsuit, Powers versus Federal Bureau of Prisons, exposed internal ADX documents that showed food restrictions were often used as behavioral punishment, not safety measures. The documents included chilling notations like, "Reduce portions due to insolence. Continue loaf until compliance improves." The lawsuit also revealed that ADX kitchen staff had no medical supervision when deciding meal replacements. Some inmates received less than 1,000 calories per day, far below federal nutritional standards. When the case gained media attention, Amnesty International released a public statement declaring that such practices constitute cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment under international law. Yet, no major policy change followed. Inside the system, retaliation was swift. After one inmate's letter about the food was published by a local newspaper, he was transferred to a more restrictive unit and had his communication privileges revoked. In another case, an inmate who testified about his disciplinary loaf diet suddenly lost access to the prison commissary. "They silenced us by taking away the little comfort we had left, the right to choose a snack," he wrote. "They call it order. I call it starvation with paperwork." Even some corrections officers began to express unease. In confidential interviews with The Guardian and the Marshall Project, a few admitted that denying food was the quiet punishment no one talked about. One said, "If they misbehaved, we didn't beat them. We fed them the loaf. That was the same thing, just slower." These testimonies didn't just expose abuse, they humanized it. They reminded the world that the men behind those concrete walls weren't monsters. They were human beings, reduced to numbers, stripped of voice, but still capable of truth. By 2015, public pressure grew. Illinois shuttered Tamms, and activists began calling for federal review of ADX Florence's conditions. Yet, the Bureau of Prisons issued a statement insisting that meals meet or exceed nutritional standards. But for those who lived through it, the damage was already done, physically and psychologically. One anonymous ADX survivor summarized it in a single line, later quoted in a 2017 Human Rights Watch report. "They don't have to torture you with chains. They can do it with bread." Behind the walls of ADX Florence, where every movement is monitored and every decision is made by unseen hands, food is not merely a necessity, it's a system of control. The kitchen, buried deep within the prison's secure wing, is a place few outsiders have ever seen. But according to court records, staff interviews, and leaked Bureau of Prisons memos, it's not just where meals are prepared, it's where obedience is engineered. In most prisons, the kitchen hums with activity. Inmates working, trays clattering, steam hissing from industrial pots. But at ADX Florence, there are no inmate cooks. No clatter. No chatter. Everything is mechanized. Meals are pre-portioned, sealed, and delivered by officers in full gear. Each tray weighed and recorded, is slid through the slot of a solitary cell like an offering from a ghost. The moment it passes through, the slot locks shut. Every tray at ADX represents a hierarchy of privilege. Standard inmates receive 2,600 calories a day, cold breakfast, reheated lunch, a light dinner. But the slightest infraction can change that. Refuse an order? Lose 600 calories. Flood your cell? Restricted diet. Yell at an officer? Loaf. The control extends beyond punishment. According to a 2014 Federal Bureau of Prisons audit, even the temperature of meals is deliberately regulated to be lukewarm, minimizing comfort. Hot meals are a reward, one guard told a former warden during an internal review. You don't reward misbehavior. In essence, every bite is conditional. Every calorie earned. Every flavor permissioned. As one former ADX staffer revealed in a deposition, we learned early that hunger made inmates compliant. You can't fight when you're weak. This philosophy traces back to the design of supermax prisons themselves, built in the 1990s under the theory of total control. The goal wasn't just to isolate the body but to condition the mind. And what better way to control the mind than to manipulate the most basic human need? Food is the only form of physical interaction left in solitary confinement. No touch, no sound, no companionship, only the arrival of a tray. So, when that tray becomes inconsistent, tasteless, or humiliating, it communicates power more effectively than any baton. A missed item or smaller portion sends a message. A delayed delivery tells an inmate, "You exist on our time, not yours." Former prisoner William Sablin, who spent over a decade in ADX, said the worst punishment wasn't isolation, it was the unpredictability. You never knew what you were getting. Sometimes there was meat, sometimes just beans and bread. Once they gave me 2 dry tortillas and an apple. I thought it was a joke. Sablin described how men began obsessing over meal trays, pressing their ears to the doors to hear the sound of the cart rolling down the hall. It was like Pavlov's dog, he said. You hear wheels and your stomach tightens. You pray your name's not on the restricted list. A former ADX correctional officer, speaking to the Marshall Project, confirmed that kitchen control logs were sometimes used as disciplinary tools. Officers could request portion reductions for disruptive inmates, even without medical oversight. In one case, an inmate's portions were reduced for an entire week because he allegedly spoke disrespectfully during meal delivery. The practice wasn't unique to ADX. At Tamms, Pelican Bay, and Red Onion State Prison, similar systems existed where meal privileges were tied to behavioral compliance. A 2012 ACLU investigation revealed that some supermax facilities even used meal timing, delaying lunch or dinner by several hours, to break resistance during lockdowns. Dr. Craig Haney, a psychologist who studied solitary confinement for decades, wrote, "Food becomes the last remaining form of communication between captor and captive. It's the quietest form of punishment, and the most effective." Inside ADX, this reality becomes ritual. Inmates count seconds between trays, memorize delivery sounds, track the faint aroma of food drifting down the corridor like a calendar of survival. When your entire world shrinks to 12 steps of concrete, 3 meals become the rhythm of existence. Control the meal, and you control the mind. And that's precisely what ADX was built to do. As one anonymous letter smuggled from the control unit put it, they don't need chains. They use hunger instead. It's cleaner. There's a quiet science to starvation, and inside isolation units like ADX Florence, that science plays out behind closed doors, tray by tray, day after day. The human body can adapt to many things: darkness, silence, loneliness. But hunger? Hunger changes everything. Inside ADX, the absence of adequate food doesn't always lead to visible skeletons or fainting fits. The damage is slower, invisible at first, creeping through the body like rust in a locked engine. Former inmates who spent years under restricted diets describe the same arc: fatigue, dizziness, muscle wasting, then a hollowing of the face and eyes. But the real damage begins when the body starts feeding on itself. Nutritionists who reviewed records from Tamms Correctional Center and ADX Florence found that inmates on restricted diets sometimes consumed fewer than 1,200 calories per day, barely half the recommended intake for adult men. One internal BOP memo from 2006 described temporary calorie reductions as acceptable discipline. But doctors saw the results: hair loss, brittle nails, skin sores, and severe vitamin deficiencies. In one medical report, a 48-year-old ADX inmate was noted to have symptoms consistent with malnutrition, despite no underlying disease. Then there's the mind, and that's where starvation does its deepest work. Dr. Terry Kupers, one of the leading psychiatrists studying solitary confinement, calls the combination of isolation and hunger a psychological crucible. When the body weakens, the mind begins to break. Hunger strips away self-control, and the brain becomes hypersensitive to fear and despair. Inside those concrete boxes, where daylight is rationed like hope, hunger becomes a form of disorientation. Inmates have reported hearing voices, hallucinating food smells, or dreaming vividly of meals they hadn't eaten in decades. One former Tamms inmate wrote, "I could smell fried chicken for hours, but it wasn't real. It was just my brain torturing me." The 2003 Minnesota starvation experiment, conducted on volunteers during World War II, found that even moderate food restriction caused anxiety, depression, irritability, and obsessive thoughts about eating. Prison psychologists have compared ADX inmates' behavior to those volunteers, except the men in Florence aren't volunteers, and their starvation is paired with 23-hour isolation, fluorescent lights, and total silence. In one lawsuit, Powers versus Federal Bureau of Prisons, medical experts testified that inmates subjected to disciplinary diets showed signs of neurocognitive decline, difficulty concentrating, memory loss, and emotional numbness. Some stopped eating altogether, spiraling into psychosis or self-harm. A 2015 report by Human Rights Watch documented several such cases. One ADX prisoner began eating paper to trick his stomach into feeling full. Another smeared his uneaten loaf on the wall and wrote "Feed me human" in what appeared to be ketchup. A third hoarded meal trays under his bed, convinced the guards were poisoning the food. Hunger and paranoia feed each other in isolation. When the body is starved, the mind turns against itself. Sleep becomes restless, perception distorts. Some prisoners began mistaking the sound of footsteps for whispers, the rattle of a tray for a conversation that never existed. The human metabolism slows as the body conserves energy. Heart rate drops. Blood pressure plummets. But inside ADX, that's not considered a crisis, it's compliance. When a prisoner grows too weak to shout, file grievances, or resist, the system labels him stable. A former ADX psychologist later admitted anonymously, "They didn't want to fix the hunger. They wanted it to work. It made the inmates quiet." And so, the starvation continues, masked by paperwork, justified by policy, hidden under terms like restricted diet or nutritional sanction. Even when prisoners return to general population or are released, the body remembers. Survivors describe a lifelong obsession with food, hoarding snacks, overeating, or panicking when meals are late. Psychologists call it post-starvation hypervigilance, the body's permanent mistrust of comfort. Jack Powers, now an advocate for prison reform, said in an interview years after his release, "It's been 10 years since I left ADX and I still can't throw food away. I still eat in silence. I still look at every plate like it might be taken from me." That's the legacy of hunger in isolation. It doesn't end when the tray stops coming. It stays, buried in the bones, wired into the brain, carried like an invisible sentence that outlasts the prison walls. When a man has nothing left, no voice, no touch, no freedom, his only weapon is his own body. Inside the soundproof cells of ADX Florence and other isolation units, hunger has become more than a symptom of neglect. It's become a language, a rebellion, a final way to be heard in a system built to silence. Hunger strikes in U.S. prisons are as old as solitary confinement itself. But in supermax facilities they carry a darker weight. There are no cameras, no visitors, no crowds outside chanting for justice. There is only one man, a concrete cell, and the slow, deliberate act of refusing food, a form of protest invisible to the world. In 2004, a coordinated hunger strike began at ADX Florence. The participants were a small group of men in the control unit, inmates like Jack Powers, Mickey Featherstone, and Richard Lee McNair, all serving decades in near total isolation. Their demands were simple: access to phone calls, religious services, and humane food. They refused meals for more than 3 weeks. By the second week, prison officials began force-feeding them through nasal tubes. Powers later recalled, "It felt like drowning in silence. They called it medical care. I called it punishment for speaking out." The Bureau of Prisons later admitted the strike occurred but denied that food quality or solitary conditions were factors. Still, leaked internal reports told a different story. Officials classified the protest as a disturbance event, and afterward, participants were stripped of privileges, confirming that even peaceful resistance carried a cost. At Tamms Correctional Center, similar strikes erupted between 2009 and 2012. One of the most notable involved Anthony Gay, who spent 14 years in solitary. His hunger strike lasted 22 days. Guards monitored his vitals twice daily, but he refused to relent. In a letter to the Chicago Tribune he wrote, "They want to kill your spirit by starving you. So I starve myself first, to show I still have control over something." Gay's strike and others like it caught the attention of human rights groups. Amnesty International, the John Howard Association, and the Uptown People's Law Center began to pressure Illinois officials. By 2013 Tamms was shut down. But at ADX Florence nothing changed. Instead, officials perfected what they called medical intervention protocols. Hunger strikers were restrained and force-fed a liquefied mixture through tubes inserted into the nose, a process inmates described as excruciating. In 2015, The Guardian obtained internal memos describing involuntary nourishment procedures that could be performed without judicial oversight. Dr. Stephen Miles, a physician who reviewed some of those cases, said, "Force-feeding in solitary confinement is not medical treatment, it's the continuation of torture under a clinical disguise." Some inmates saw hunger strikes as their only form of speech. One ADX letter later used in a lawsuit read, "They took my phone. They took my visits. They took my light. But they can't take this, my decision not to eat." And so hunger became protest. But protest in isolation rarely leads to victory. For every Anthony Gay who forced public attention, there are dozens whose starvation went unnoticed, recorded only as non-compliance in prison logs. The psychological toll of such strikes is immense. Medical experts note that after about 10 days without food, the brain begins to degrade decision-making ability. After 20 days, hallucinations can start. After 40, organ failure becomes imminent. Yet many inmates persist, driven not by hope of reform but by a desperate need to reclaim autonomy, the one freedom they have left, control over their own body. Between 2010 and 2020 hunger strikes spread to dozens of facilities: Pelican Bay, Rikers Island, Red Onion State Prison, and even Guantanamo Bay. In all of them the message was the same: we are still human. At Guantanamo, inmates strapped to restraint chairs were force-fed through tubes as military medics watched their weight charts. One former detainee, Sami Al-Hajj, said in a 2014 interview, "When they feed you by force it's not food anymore. It's pain disguised as nutrition." The parallels between Guantanamo and ADX Florence were striking. Both facilities used isolation, control, and food as psychological tools. Both justified their actions through security. And both produced hunger, the kind that breaks men twice, once in the body and again in the soul. One ADX inmate captured that truth in a single devastating line from a smuggled letter. "They think hunger makes you weak. But it's the only thing that reminds me I'm alive." In the end, hunger strikes are less about victory and more about visibility, a silent scream from within the walls of America's most secretive prisons. The tragedy is that even when the strikes end, the hunger never does. It lingers, not just in the inmates who protested, but in the conscience of a nation that allowed them to reach such desperation in the first place. Across the cold corridors of ADX Florence and every isolation block that came before it, hunger has never just been about food. It's about power, who gives it, who withholds it, and who's forced to beg for it. The forgotten hunger of these men is more than a physical ache. It's a reflection of what happens when punishment goes too far, when a system built for justice begins to feed on cruelty. Former inmates, human rights workers, and even retired guards agree on one thing: the body eventually recovers from starvation, but the mind does not. Hunger lingers like a memory that can't be erased, a quiet echo of every meal denied, every bite used as leverage, every silent night spent listening for the sound of a tray that never came. Jack Powers once said after his release, "I left the cell but the hunger followed me out." And that's the truth America still has to face, the kind of hunger that doesn't end when the sentence does.